Okay, well, I'm going to get started. Thank you all. This is Mr. Hacker Goes to Washington. My name is Greg Elin. I'm actually the chief evangelist at the Sunlight Foundation. I have a new title this year. So quick orientation. Our nation started with hackers, which I think is pretty important. It was a big change in the system. And when it began, very important, information was always a key part. One of our founding hackers was a printer himself. But back then, P2P really meant press plus parliament. And that has a big consequence as we move forward to today. There's been a huge tradition in the United States of people being involved with their government. I mean, that's the founding principle. Individuals going to DC and making a difference. But what's happening right now is that we have this different trend of how people go to DC. They don't go as individual representatives. They can go in a different way because of the internet and the technology. So what we have happening now in 2009, we have all these different organized groups of hackers and other people that are bringing people to DC, bringing people to local government. Sunlight Foundation, of which I'm a part, is kind of driven by two quotes. Sunlight is the best disinfectants by Louis Brandeis, and given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So kind of combining those two ideas and trying to be a catalyst for greater government openness and transparency. So the Sunlight Foundation, we're nonpartisan, we're a nonprofit. Executive Director Ellen Miller, we have a multi-million-dollar budget, but we do a lot of grants. And we're actually growing. We work very much on digitizing data. We're very interested in the nexus of money and influence and politics. We started by just looking at Congress from 2000. We started by just focusing on Congress because they're the people's representatives, but we're starting to get into now the larger federal government and also the state. We do investigations. We have some journalists that are on staff. And the Sunlight Labs, which I actually helped put together, is very focused on leading by example, by making things. We're actually hiring at the Sunlight Labs. We're going to be hiring 4 or 5 people. And we're transforming the labs from a kind of internal mashup house to open source development. The big goal here is actually reestablishing and improving trust. And that you can do that by more openness and transparency, and also seizing opportunities. Now, this opportunity is not merely the first African-American president for the United States or change in political parties, which always creates opportunities. But the fact is, I have been to an event like this, and the real opportunity is that everybody has a cell phone. And when they are standing there waiting for the speakers to happen, because you have to come very early to an event like this, they are playing, everyone is playing on their cell phones. So what's it like in Washington, D.C.? I came to Washington, D.C. 3 years ago in 2006, and I've come to feel like it's really like a big university with a very large ROTC group. A very important thing is that majority rules almost absolutely in Washington, D.C. So a couple of quick anecdotes, because it was only recently in 2006 that we had a change in majority of Congress. And so what we heard happening is that the majority would get the new BlackBerries, and they would give the minority the old BlackBerries. Many of the committees are really the domain of whoever is the chair, and the chair is the most senior person for the majority party. Many of the committees in Congress, and there are about 30 committees in each the House and the Senate, have a majority website and a minority website. When the majority changes, offices change. Because you get the big office if you're in the majority for certain things. And sometimes your number of staff also changes. So if you imagine back to the university model, you can imagine that you're suddenly one day, there's an election and the next semester starts, and the English department has to change places with the science department. I like to think of the internet as Ethernet. I really love how Ethernet works under the hood, that anyone can talk, that it's kind of a public network, that there's a protocol for backing off when there's a collision. Really exciting, no prioritization. But if the internet is Ethernet, Congress is a token ring network. If you think about it, parliamentary procedure is really about making sure people have the floor. So there's a talking stick. You have a certain amount of time on the floor. No one else can talk while you're talking. Everyone has to wait their turns. And this trickles out to the way the rest of the way that the rest of Congress works. There were simply no BlackBerries or cell phones or computers when these procedures and these institutions were set up. I was watching the Senate the other day do a roll call vote, 100 senators, roll call vote, more than 10 minutes, because they call audibles. Also, Congress is paper-based. It's still a reality. More things are turning electronic, but the reality is that it's paper-based. Of course, and I know that Tim is really into this, we fantasize about Congress having versioning system for legislation. We keep thinking, we've got it for code, why can't they do it for legislation? We know that it works for documents, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to say, this is actually a little pet peeve of mine. Legal code is not the same as software code. Very few of you are writing software code that is designed to change things that are 50 or 100 years old. So if you think about it, we're very fortunate. We live completely in the digital world. The tools that we're using to create things in the software world are the tools that are using to consume those. And underneath the hood is a very rigorous logic in which we're all kind of trained. And we're trained every day by writing the code, because if we don't write it correctly, it doesn't compile, it doesn't run. We have this objective third party that's saying this doesn't work. With legal code, it's all about fuzzy rhetoric. So here's an example. As you recall, I know that we've had a lot of budget crises that have happened recently, et cetera, but as you recall, last fall, there was a banking crisis that began, and there was a desire to move through a very large package, $700 billion, in order to prop up the banking system. It had to move through the House, and it had to move through the Senate. It failed in the House, and the Senate had to get it through. Now, the Senate had to move quickly. So, oops, sorry. OK, so what we're looking at here, is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, a modification on the Employee Retirement Security Act around the provision of mental health and substance-related disorder benefits. What the Senate decided to do, or what what happened was, you'll notice the bottom line, they made an amendment to this bill, which was already moving through. They made an amendment to strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. So if you think about this, you're writing code, the code is designed, I don't know, to be a word processor, and someone comes along and basically says, my patch is to turn your word processor into, I don't know, a database. And so that's what a patch looks like in Congress, or what it can look like. And I'm not exactly sure how we do versioning on that. This is a video we actually made of the different versions of the bill as it got longer and longer and more earmarks were added. You'll notice at the upper right of this bill, there's actually a link to a drive somewhere on Congress's network for an XML version of the bill. So Congress actually has more than 95% of its bills being written in XML, which is actually really cool. But we don't see them until later on in the process. We don't necessarily see them at the earliest stages. We don't necessarily see all bills. Even if they're available in XML, we don't see them right away. They have to be enrolled on the floor. They have to go through different processes. A lot of bills do come up, but not all of them come up. They move through very quickly. So the big point here is that government, it's not so much that it has lots of legacy systems. Government overall is a legacy system. It is an attempt, it is designed around getting groups of people to work together and coordinate their activities. And it is based on and it's designed around much older technologies basically from the Constitution forward. So one of the primary assumptions that is embedded in, that's embedded in the legacy system is that it assumes one mouse. This was actually a project. There was a person, I think, last year, is this HP or Microsoft, I think, did this research, but it really interesting work. But the interesting thing here, of course, is what happens when you have more than one mouse. I always look at this because I imagine the guy with one mouse, that's the elected official. Then you've got the lobbyists and the activists surrounding them. But what's interesting, what they found out is once they added more than one mouse, you had to change the underlying software application because the applications had been designed for one user at a time. This is the government. This is the government operating stack. Starts at the Constitution. I know you all know this, but I want to emphasize it. There are 3 branches of government. And they are equal branches of government, and they're checks and balances. There's Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial. Congress has 2 houses, each with their own traditions and rules, each with their own set of committees. Every piece of legislation must move through both of them and get reconciled before it goes to the president to sign. Each representative, 435 of them in the House of Representatives, represents more than 600,000 people in their district. That's really relevant when you start thinking about them trying to handle email from those different representatives, from those different citizens. And you can imagine that if you have 600,000 people, majority is only 301,000. I mean, it's not a lot of people. So it's very big. It's very big, and it's really interesting when you go into the halls of Congress. And if you look at congressional website pages, there's much more emphasis on the representative as an individual than there is, say, the institution of the representation for that state. Just as when the committees change over, every time the individual who's elected change over, they are the representative. There's no real sense, and you get that as you move through the offices and other things like that. You see it coming underneath on the executive branch. Lots of different departments. This is only a subset of the different departments that exist on the executive branch. The executive branch does most of the day-to-day lifting of what happens in government. Sunlight started with Congress. We're now starting to do the executive branch. We're not really involved in judicial. And the judicial branch, of course, is the one that does the interpretation and makes calls between things. I love this slide. I love this graphic because that's essentially what the executive branch looks like. There are more than 1,300 agencies in the executive branch. Some of them are independent agencies, meaning they were created by Congress rather than the executive branch. The FEC is a kind of independent agency. And it's 2,000 people. And it's considered a rather small agency with 2,000 people. So the IT operation inside of the FEC is basically about managing 1,500 or more computers and laptops and things like that. The FCC does a lot more than simply what's happening on television. There's all sorts of things with a lot of RFID, et cetera, not RFID, but anything that has a radio signal. And it was really set up to cover a very small thing initially, and its power has expanded exponentially as new technologies have taken advantage of the radio spectrum. So and the FCC is going to be a very interesting place. So some other facts here. Think about every agency as its own enterprise. Accounting between these different agencies actually started back under Nixon. Total IT budget annually, $71 billion. 2.75 million civilian staff. There's actually a government website that is about staff across the government. And you can get all sorts of statistics on this site. I just brought up a few numbers here so you can get a sense. Now, this is very interesting. More than 30% of the civilian workforce, many senior positions, are retiring, are turning over in the next 5 years. Yeah, it's kind of still, there's still a big turnover, but I checked this statistic. I've got a couple of different statistics, but between now and 2012, there's a very big turnover that's happening. So big opportunity, real opportunities. Washington, D.C. has a beautiful subway system. I really like this. It's a really lovely subway system. It's a lovely subway system because it was built fairly recently. But the reality with infrastructure, and this is the New York City subway system. New York was one of the first subways that was built. And one of the things that happens when you build infrastructure and you're an early mover is you are stuck with that as the technology improves. This is the internal IT structure of government. The United States government was very smart. They invested in mainframe computers. They invested early in automating things. So we may laugh at that. We may look at government and say, my God, I can't believe that they have these systems. They're so old and outdated. But it's really the New York City subway system that they have landed with and are trying to change. And it's not easy. Also, Congress does have a subway system. So nothing significant here other than I found a picture of it and I thought it was really cool. This is a graphic of the procurement for the Department of Defense. Well, I don't have a, government runs on a, I don't know what the right word would be, but the decisions have to be made in advance of the activities. It is a pre-hoc world in government, right? So if you're, and this is one of the other big differences between the world we live in, it's very hard to fork a highway or a submarine. So there is a pattern where you have to make decisions and you have to make commitments that are going to happen over many years, and you have to make them up front in a very rapidly changing marketplace, technology, cultural environment, and, as we know very well, geopolitical environment. So how do you do that? So basically, everything is thought, it's, measure once, measure twice, cut once, and you think about the implications of that when you're trying to procure it. I recently heard from some friends at GSA that they are now working on their 2011 budgets. I think the other thing is, this ends up looking the way it does, not because people don't know what they're doing, is because they've made mistakes and they're trying to figure out how to do it better. Exactly. So there's also a lot of other people that are in Washington, D.C. There are think tanks everywhere. You can't turn around without knocking over a nonprofit or a lobbyist. And there's also something called the Federal Advisory Committee, forget what the last one is, but FACA for short. There are more than 1,000 ongoing committees that are set up for the public, for individuals with expertise to interact with the 1,300 agencies, some 75,000 people. So there actually is a mechanism for expertise to come into the different agencies. The reason it was set up is you don't want to necessarily let people provide advice for free to people in government. You would say, why not? Well, the problem is, what happens if Microsoft is providing advice on what kind of infrastructure to design? Or Google is providing advice. So you're very cautious about what the quid pro quo is. So there's a process set up for that. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, Sunlight focused a lot on money and politics. The website opensecrets.org tracks contributions. You can actually see who voted no for the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act versus who voted yes in terms of their total campaign contribution dollars. It's not always this obvious, and we can't say for certain whether there's just merely correlation here or whether there's causation. But this is but the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act removes certain types of oversight and disclosure rules associated with the market. I love this video if you ever get a chance to Google it or to see it. It's the housing prices from the early 1900s to today, basically graphed as a roller coaster that you can ride. This is what it looked like in 2007 when this video was made and they stopped. Coming back to the bailout, the initial draft of the legislation from the Fed was only 3 pages. They asked for $700 billion. And what really got people insane, other than that number, is Section 8, the review, where it essentially says that pursuant to this authority, non-reviewable. Nobody can challenge it. A friend of mine, Bill Allison at the Sunlight Foundation, actually said that he looked at some other legislation and some other rules and said that that's actually not uncommon, because you don't want every decision that is made with respect to a contractor being examined by a congressional committee. Think about what's happened with the Boeing and the Airbus and what kind of time that's added to the decision or figuring things out. I wanted to try to impress upon people here the scale of what $1 billion is. So I thought about it, and a floppy disk, $1.4 million. 1.4 million. That means the stimulus is a 787 gigabyte bill. Our 2009 budget is a 3.1 terabyte budget. And that's the US debt, 11 terabytes.
You need a different scale. That makes it sound like it could happen to my house.
Really? Does that sound like a small scale for everybody? I felt like I have such a visceral sense of of the difference between what a terabyte holds and what a megabyte holds. Yeah, but think about, okay. All right. That didn't work. I guess that didn't work.
Not many of us remember buying ETech chips.
Okay, I guess I pegged myself. All right. Okay, well, billion and trillion. Okay, so 2009 budget is $3.1 trillion. When you start doing numbers that big and you've got this group of people that you have to get it by in Congress, what you begin to do is you have to build consensus and participation. These are earmarks, only from one particular bill, not associated with the bill that we are looking with the stimulus package. But this is how the deals are sweetened, by cutting earmark deals or making sure that everyone benefits from what's happening. Okay, now at the same time, government actually really works, and it works in amazing ways. It's really quite impressive. I like this, and I think it's an untold story. Since back in the 1970s, people started to try to track how government was spending the money. And it started with external people doing financial reports and accounting, trying to guess what was going on in the government. And that led actually under Nixon to reorganize the Office of Management and Budget. And Congress also set up the Congressional Budget Office. Those things did not exist until the 1970s. And if you think about it, we're kind of in the mainframe era of computers. Just at that point in time, we're getting more office automation. It's the early 70s, and so they start to try to do accounting. In the 1980s, Reagan comes into office. He wants to make government more efficient. They're talking about bloat. They're worried about all the different spending, and we get some interest. We get the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act. We get the first consolidated reporting. So before Reagan was in office, there was no consolidated accounting across the federal government in the executive branch. 1990s, the trend continues. Remember, This system is only kind of updating and instituting new ideas every 4 or 8 years. Some big things happened. So we get our first chief financial officers in the 90s, or I think that might have actually just been a reform act. But 2 big systems that are in bold, FADS and FPDS. FADS is for the financial awards accounting data system. So any type of Social Security or any type of grant that's given out to individuals is the FADS system. Roughly, I think, $300 million a year, $300 billion a year, sorry. And then the FPDS, set up in these are both set up in the early 1990s, Federal Procurement Data System. Every government contract for more than $25,000 has to be reported into the FPDS. So that system actually existed, and for many years you've been able to download that data, but if you went to download that data of all the government contract transactions, it was basically a COBOL data file. And every transaction had 120 fields associated with it. Not exactly easy for ordinary human beings to use. In the 2000s, right, George Bush passes the E-Government Act. The trend continues. We also get the Federal Financial Accountability and Transparency Act that was sponsored by Coburn and Obama, and a co-sponsor was McCain. And the FFADA Act, the Federal Accountability and Transparency Act, required an end-user searchable website for looking through the FADS and the FPDS. And that's established a site called usaspending.gov. And so usaspending.gov is interesting because we're also now getting, so this happens in 2006. Now we have the recovery.gov, and we have the Open Government Directive coming up, which I'll talk more about. There's also a site, webcontent.gov, because there's actually a council of web managers inside the government. GPS positioning systems. CDC did an absolutely amazing design and has information about how they did that design on their site. So you can see that the web is really taking hold. XML is arriving. The middle one is actually called ET.gov for emerging technology.gov. And also XML in the House. Washington, D.C., the municipality, has a wonderful data catalog where you can go and you can see all the different data feeds that they put online. So why Mr. Hacker went to Washington? 9/11. I was in New York, and I remember people trying to find people, trying to share information at that time. And I think what we forget is that when 9/11 happened, a lot of the tools we have today didn't exist. This is the very well-known Technorati graph. It goes from 03 to 07, from 2 million blogs in 03 to 78 million blogs in 07. Here's what's happening on the political spectrum at that time. So September 11th happened before all of this. So Meetup gets set up very quickly after September 11th. And I think that there were a lot of people who were very close to the web who were trying to figure out how to use it. And those of us that were in New York and helping out in a variety of different ways, and people who were sending emails into the Red Cross of offering assistance, people found out very quickly that we had no ad hoc systems we could stand up to track the requests, to track the assets that people were offering, to track the social networks. This was absent. So I think it's kind of interesting what begins to take place. We get this, and if I go back for 1 second, Howard Dean has ended by the beginning of 2004. He's had this meteoric rise, raising information, raising stuff on the web. Web blogs are still not very big. He's raised a lot of money, and then we get this pop of activity. We get the major Web 2.0 sites set up. We get the Web 2.0 Summit suddenly appearing. Down there you can see Blue State Digital is created out of people who worked for Howard Dean. And we get the Personal Democracy Forum set up by Andrew O'Shea and Micha Sifry to talk about how people are starting to use technology in the web. And then you can see what happens. YouTube, My Society gets going. Sunlight is in 2006. The lab is set up shortly afterwards. We get other sites appearing. We get the eight principles of open data, and we're at the 2008 elections. You can see the rapid movement of people coming to this. This is an early earmark project that we did, but back then in 2000, it had only been a year before. This was 2006. Only a year before was housingmaps.com come up. Suddenly we can start tracking information, how people are doing on their different groups. We have data coming from social networks. Other people are starting to get involved in the politics, and we have a new type of mass participation by 2008. These are all of the Obama house parties that were set up, represented on Google Earth. None of this was available in 2000 at the previous presidential cycle in 2004. The new federal CIO is Vivek Kundra. He's the one who did the data catalog at Washington, D.C., and he has long had this image of the digital public square. Some cool opportunities that are happening. The SEC is going to XBRL and better markup. That's a huge opportunity. USA Spending, describing this. This is the front end to the FADS and the FPDS. It's actually based on a website we did, fedspending.org. And it's based on a site that a nonprofit, and they actually bought the code. And they have a wiki set up that very few people know about. The Open House Project interacted with members of Congress. The Open House Project set up a great email list for making recommendations about congressional websites. And you've all seen thomas.gov. govtrack.us takes information from thomas.gov, makes it available in XML and RDF. They're on the linked open data map. Open Congress is a Sunlight-related project by the Participatory Politics Foundation. It's a social network. This is a big deal, what's happening with the recovery.gov and the agency.gov sites. The law mandated that they have a site up that showed what was happening with the money. The exciting thing is that every other agency also had to create a web pages that were all at their agency.gov/recovery and has to be reporting via RSS. This is the first time we have seen web-native, public-facing, interagency communications. And it's setting off a really great dynamic. And this was all launched in 1 month, which tells you something about the growing competence of the web developers inside of government and the value of doing things in a web way. This is a really big deal. It's called the Open Government Directive. You can Google it. You can find out more. Obama signed almost in the first week in office. He signed the Open Government. He signed a memo about government transparency and that government should be transparent, participatory, and collaborative. 120 days from then, so sometime in May, there is going to be a directive issued. It's called the Open Government Directive, and it's going to be specific information for agencies to do to make themselves more transparent, participatory, and collaborative. The CTO is going to be involved in that. The CIO of Vivek Kundra is going to be involved in it, and you all have an opportunity to be involved in it as well. So this is a real thing that's happening. One of the things we're doing is our open government list, where we're tracking ideas that we can feed in for what we would like to have as a part of that operation. GOP.com has an RFP out right now because they're redesigning. They've already added an API to GOP.gov because they want to catch up to what happened during the last election. Mobile's going to be huge in 2010. Huge. Oh, this is what's happening at Sunlight. We're working on building a data commons. We're doing more open source. And we're going to press for more real-time disclosure. At the end of this month, March 31st, submit your applications for Apps for America, $15,000 grand prize. There are already 300 people on the Sunlight Labs developer list. We have some interesting people that are working on applications. So this is if you want to do something, go check out Apps for America. Great, all you have to do is use some of our APIs, and you can do whatever you want. We're going to start doing hackathons at Sunlight. I think we're going to do one at Web 2.0 Expo. Show us the data. I'm going to move a little bit quicker here. These are some really important dates. We just finished Transparency Camp. Thank you. There's another government, actually tomorrow night, in San Francisco at MetaWeb's office, there's an open data meetup for a group out here in San Francisco. The Bar Camp Government 2.0. The Open Government Directive is in May. Vivek Kundra has said that they're going to launch data.gov. I don't have any more information other than they're going to launch it. And then, of course, the O'Reilly conference, the government. Oh, I want to just go back. I'm almost, and let's see. These are the patterns that I'm seeing that have worked really well. You can create model alternatives. Carl Malama did this with the SEC, with Edgar, putting the information online. We did it with OMB Watch did it with fedspending.org. You can create the alternative on the web, people start to use it, and force government to adopt it. You can aggregate information. You can have hosted discussions, distributed projects. These are the big challenges. Licensing agreements, access for disability, but web standards actually provide for a lot, gets you 80% of the way there for doing compliance. Our big attitude, public means online. You have to have data that's human and machine friendly. There's something called the 8 Principles of Open Data, which we're pushing to get into government to understand that, moving towards more timely information. Some great places to start. Sunlight Labs API, there's an email list called the Polyparse list. GovTrack.us is really good. Public.resource. My Society, who I've not given a lot of attention, they have done some wonderful work over in the UK, not simply, and their model has really been making easy ways for individuals to help each other and to help government. And that's it. Thanks. This is actually the growth of the word transparency in the New York, that came from the New York Times using the new New York Times API from 1990 to 2008. There are a few minutes left for a question.
Greg, one of the graphs you showed was the rise of various legislation, in some sense sponsoring government transparency and oversight, but on the other hand, also creating all of these layers of historical mandates saying you must do it this particular way. And the thing I'm really struck by is you imagine a company in which strategic changes were driven by actual laws, where you say from now on you will always do it this way. How hard would it be? And I guess one of the questions I have with all of this is, are we focusing enough on figuring out what laws we need to get rid of and change? It seems like this is the biggest obstacle. When I was in DC, this was
Right. So you've got both. You have both. It is. So you, and if you've ever looked at a government contract, it's fascinating because you see the support for minorities, you see the support for all these different requirements, which really are just this silt built up over time of people trying to fix problems. So you've got two obstacles. You've got actual laws, and you've got rules that interpret those laws. Part of the Open Government Directive includes identifying things that need to change. So that's part of the impact that we can have, and that the current administration hopes to have through the Open Government Directive. But it is very true that there is not, the government is not very good at time to live, how long something is good for. Any other questions? Okay.
Is anybody working on discussion technology itself? I mean, the nature of discussions now, our Congress uses a technology which was perhaps developed in Parliament 400 years ago, and it's all based on the metaphor of war. Who's going to win and who's going to lose? And that always creates problems. But there are people who are working on discussion technologies based on, for example,
Right.
So the discussion itself is educational.
Right. There are definitely a lot of people that are in the politics space that are intrigued by the notions of how to do collaborative policy development, collaborative law development. How do you have debate online where you can detect the consensus of the group? It's not a big area of focus for Sunlight because we're more focused on pulling information out of the government than this, but it's clearly a big issue of how do you deal with 3,000 or 30,000 comments on a piece of legislation. I personally think that someone will figure out how to do that, and I don't know how to get that solution. But I know that it's only going to come with more information being online, more tools being available. So I think we're seeing it, and I think Congress is starting. More members of Congress are experimenting with electronic town halls, and there's a group called USA Speaks that does some very interesting work on coordinating face-to-face and mediated large-scale discussions. But it's a very challenging area, just not one that we do a lot with.
Two-part question. The first, in this last spending bill went through, I understand that 7 Republicans voted for it, but 20 Republicans issued press releases about bringing money back to their constituents. And so there's a discrepancy there, and obviously that applies to Democrats as well. Is there a database that you know of that has dollars that are voted against?
Dollars that are voted against?
Yes. In other words, like, let's say they're arguing an amendment added to this bill, and they successfully...
That sounds like a great thing for Apps for America contest. No, I actually don't. There are definitely data from the Washington Post and other places that are tracking bills, and they're tracking votes. So you can go to, so Washington Post has a good votes database, GovTrax has a good votes database. Part of what the Sunlight Labs API offers is simply an ID registry, so that you can, if you can get a member of Congress and you can get their ID in other systems, the BioGuide, the GovTrack, the Open Secrets, the Washington Post vote database. Washington Post has also done something called Who Runs Gov that they've just launched. So, but I don't know anybody that's actually tried to correlate dollars voted against, either in terms of, but it's also a very nasty problem because how do you measure a dollar? Do you measure it as a tax? Do you measure it as a direct give, et cetera? And I'm supposed to be wrapping up, but I'm happy to talk to...
My follow-up question was,
Well, yeah, I mean, I should really wrap. I should wrap. Do I have 2 minutes left, or I should just end it? I got 2 minutes. Okay.
if you had to give advice to somebody in the House right now who is very receptive, where would you start? What would you tell them to implement technologically? Like, should they go to WordPress? Should they enable comments? How should a member of the House engage us most effectively right now for maximum transparency?
I don't know if I would recommend a particular. I don't think that there is a once. I would say one. That there's already a trend of people beginning to use the new Web 2.0 tools. So I would actually say the first thing to do is to make web a strategic asset inside of the organization and appoint a new media director and build a web team and start experimenting with a range of tools, right? Start twittering, start using RSS. The Open House Project has recommendations on how members of Congress information can be better. I would certainly say to make your information more transparent to your community. I think the members that are starting to make their information more transparent, that are starting to do videos, are finding that it is resonating with their community. And I think any type of Web 2.0 development is an iterative, interactive process. I don't think that there's a single solution.
Just a comment. Transparent and communication are two different things. So using Twitter doesn't mean you're transparent. It just means you communicate.
Yes. I think that there's as you start to use these tools, though, they come with affordances that are hard to resist. You know, that there's an aspect to, you can't get real transparency unless you're in the real-time world, because if you're only filing lobbyist information or campaign finance information significantly after the fact, that doesn't provide transparency anyway, or the transparency it does provide is forensic transparency. So I think something like Twitter is very powerful because it teaches people, it gives them the chance to experience a level of interactivity and real-time engagement that they don't get through other things. And that creates a positive cycle of other types of development. But yeah, anything can be gamed. I think that's, I'm going to,
So, like, in my head, like, politics is about where power lives in society. Part of that is our politicians. But it lives in other places too, so it's like the press, companies, this kind of stuff. So if we're doing our parliaments now, what do we do? Where do we take transparency to next? What's the next big thing after we've done politicians?
well, after we've done politicians, I think that there's a real dearth of information about the constituents. What is the makeup of a congressional district? What is its money makeup? We don't have good profiles of congressional districts and their behavior. Nobody has really developed something that just simply looks at all of the newspaper articles, all of the comments, all of the blogs, and kind of comes up with a weekly gestalt of what the community is talking about. So I think that there's obviously the executive branch, there's driving down, but you've got the politicians, but just having a good profile in the politicians, we can't have a good profile in the politicians unless we have a good context on who they are representing. And that's what I'd say. Thank you very much for sticking around through all of this.